The first sign isn't the white wall swallowing the horizon, or the radio spitting static like a snake. It's the way the wind shifts from a restless hiss to a low, sustained pressure, as if a giant hand presses flat across the Wyoming plains and keeps pressing. Sarah stands on the porch with the storm in her teeth, a coil of baling twine in her pocket, and a hammer in her hand. 30 miles to town in one direction, nothing but pasture and a brushy creek in the other. The sky looks like it's been erased. She tastes copper on her tongue. The radio behind her coughs
Easy
out the
now,
word
girl.
blizzard, then goes to a saw blade
All right.
buzz and cuts away entirely.
Just the wind.
She leaves it where it is, the little orange light still glowing, and steps back into the cold until the boards creak under her weight. Across the yard, the barn hunkers low, red paint scratched by a dozen winters, roofline crusted with the season's first hardpack. 7 horses inside. Maggie, the chestnut mare with a white dime on her forehead. Bug, the quick bay that hates a closed door. 2 gray geldings that move as one. And 3 shaggy rescues that never learned what peace feels like. They shift when the wind punches the siding, the sound traveling like a heartbeat through the ground. "All right," she says, more breath than voice. "Let's move." The first lash of snow rides sideways at face level. It stings like bees. She hunches into it, crosses the yard with her chin tucked, boot soles biting at the ice under the powder. The barn door thuds under her palm as she muscle it back. Warm, damp air rolls out, thick with hay, manure, and the sharp, metallic bite of fear. The horses crowd their partitions to see her, ears flicking, eyes wide in the dim. "Hey," she says, breath fogging. Bug rattles his gate chain like he's got a plan. She answers, and he settles, one ear canted toward her voice. She moves the line of salt blocks closer to the interior wall, where the draft isn't as mean. The waterers hum, but she doesn't trust them. She will not trust anything mechanical tonight. She breaks crust on the surface of the big rubber tubs with the heel of her glove, watches black water wink back, then goes to the feed room. Shelves hold what she put on them. Coffee cans of nails, a coil of Romex she's been meaning to return, 3 boxes of roofing screws left over from a summer repair she didn't finish. The generator's pull cord loops from its housing like a waiting snake. She checks gasoline, oil, the choke. She sets a headlamp around her neck and shoulders into the wool-lined canvas coat she keeps hung on a nail. There's a thin memory in the sleeve. Her husband's aftershave, gone as quick as it comes. She works through it. The storm will not care. Outside again, she battles past the barn's lee side to the north face where the wind hits clean. Snow hides the nails where they pulled last season. Her glove finds them anyway. She pounds in new cleats of 2x4 along the sill line, braces where the siding flexes, drives screws until the drill moans. The wind shoves her shoulder like an impatient man. She shoves back. Between blows, she listens, cocking her head to catch the wrong sound. The high, loose rattle that means the ridge cap is lifting. The hollow ring of a panel slapping its fasteners. She hears plenty that's bad, nothing that's fatal yet. On the roof cornice, a burr tuft of snow lets go and skids down in a chalky hiss, exploding in powder at her boots. She looks up into the white on white and sees nothing but movement, a blindness that moves. A thought flickers and goes. Something crossed the ridge earlier, a dark smudge against the pale. Elk, maybe, or one of the neighbor's rangy dogs too dumb to take cover. She pushes the thought away the same way she pushes the snow away from the lower eaves with a wide barn broom, running the handle back and forth to break the load. If the roof slides, it should slide on purpose, not when it wants to. The wind finds every seam in her coat. The cold threads knives along her wrists where the glove cuffs gap. She works faster. She nails a cross brace over the west window, where the glass shakes like it's got the shivers, then shoulders into the barn to check the animals again. The heat hit feels like a blanket. She takes off her hat and steam curls from her hair. They want her calm more than they want hay. She gives both. Flake by flake along the line, she drops feed into slotted mangers, talking as her hands move. "Eat up," she says. The cadence matters. Horses listen to rhythm before meaning. Maggie puts her muzzle against Sarah's shoulder and holds it there for a beat. Sarah presses her forehead to that warm, velvet place between the mare's eyes. She whispers, and the mare's breath blooms against her cheek. Somewhere above, something flexes. A low creak runs the length of the rafters, stops, then speaks again in a different key. She goes to the center aisle and tips her head back. The roof is a dark geometry above the lamplight. Beams and crossbucks she knows the names of because she has paid to replace them. A knot of ice has taken on weight along the windward edge. She notes it the way a chess player notes a piece. Not a threat yet. Not nothing. Back in the feed room, she pulls spare halters and lead ropes down and hangs them by the doors, where hands can find them in the dark. She lays bolt cutters on top of the tack trunk. The flashlight goes into her coat pocket, the second flashlight into the other. She checks her phone. No signal, as expected. The landline comes off the hook with a dead tone. She wasn't calling anyone anyway. Not tonight. At the generator, she yanks the cord until the motor coughs to life, a stubby roar that the storm swallows with a mouth full of snow. The barn takes on a different hum. The waterers gurgle stronger. A string of trouble lights she ran in July blinks on along the tack room ceiling. The bulbs, tiny suns in a small universe. She leaves it running to warm, then kills it. She won't drain the gasoline until she needs it. She will need it. In the yard, the snow is now deep enough to fill her boot prints between trips. She trudges to the house for another coil of rope and a stack of old horse blankets with wrecked straps. She means to line the feed shed floor in case she needs to move the herd. The porch boards are already wearing a polish of packed powder. Inside, she grabs a thermos and fills it with coffee she reboiled at noon. She drinks from the lid cup while staring at a photo on the fridge. 2 people and a roan gelding at the county fair, all sunburned and squint. She hears herself say to nobody, not a plea this time, more a promise. She puts the cup down. She goes back out. By now, the world isn't the world. It's a narrow tunnel between the house and the barn, a trench with walls that move and breathe. Sound is all muscle. The siding on the north wall thumps in time with the gusts. The cottonwoods at the creek crack in their joints. Once, far off, coyotes throw thin, uncommitted notes into the storm like a dare. She pivots at that sound, scanning a field she can't see. The horses lift their heads in the same instant, which tells her she didn't imagine it. She strings a line from the barn to the feed shed, ties a knot that will not fail, tests it with her weight. The shed door sticks, then gives with a dry scream. Inside is dust and wood and the lemony ghost of a summer oil spill that never quite left. She rolls out the old blankets, sets out a tub, checks the hinges with a spray of lithium grease. When she pulls the door closed again, it seals with a satisfying click. If she has to move them fast, at least she won't be fighting a latch. Another passage, another blast. Her legs are burning now from the slog in heavy clothes, from the cold's bite, from care. She forces herself to keep the pace steady, not frantic. Frantic gets you hurt. She shoulders the barn door shut and stands inside to count the seconds between roof groans, listening for the line where normal stress becomes too much. Her lamp throws a clean-edged circle on dusty plank. Flakes slip through somewhere and wink in the beam like tiny falling coins. She notices a small thing then, a scatter of faint tracks stamped into a drift just inside the man door, as if something smaller than a dog but heavier than a rabbit pressed there, tested the threshold, then turned away. She kneels to put a gloved finger to the shape and feels nothing but cold. The snow has softened the edges. She files it under later. Tonight everything softens. The day shrinks fast and uneven, light thinning out without moving the clock. She sets another flake of hay into Maggie's manger, then drags the muck fork through a corner to keep her hands busy while her ears do their work. The storm punches again. The rafters answer. Somewhere near the ridge, a nail starts a nervous chatter. She finds a ladder with her eyes and notes. After this gust, after the next. No hero moves. The gust comes like a freight train turned sideways. The barn shivers, wood complaining from sill to peak. A palm's worth of snow falls from a high seam and bursts on her shoulder like a shaken pillow. Her heart spikes and holds. The horses swing their heads all together, a flurry of white breath in the lamplight, then go back to chewing because she does not run. She says into the hum, voice steady, the shortest prayer she knows. She tucks the hammer into her belt, slips the headlamp down to her brow, and puts one hand on the ladder rail. The wind leans, listens, leans again. Above her, something heavy settles with a long, warning sigh. The beam of Sarah's flashlight wavered, catching swirls of snow that danced like ghostly ash in the freezing air. Her breath came fast and visible, the storm pushing icy fingers down the back of her coat. The barn roof still groaned under the weight of snow and ice, the fresh tear in its surface gaping like a wound. Her gaze locked on the intruder. The Bobcat was crouched low on the fractured roofline, golden eyes reflecting the light in two sharp points. Its fur, thick with frost, clung in wet clumps to its lean body. One hind leg dangled stiffly, the angle wrong in a way that made her wince. Even from here she could hear the animal's ragged breathing, slow, shallow, labored. Her instinct screamed danger. Any predator this close to her horses in the middle of a storm was a threat. Her gloved fingers slid toward the rifle she kept by the barn door, muscle memory kicking in. One clean warning shot would be enough to drive it off. She pictured the muzzle flash cutting through the snow, the crack bouncing off the timber walls. But her finger hesitated. Something in the animal's stillness kept her rooted. It didn't lunge or bare its teeth. Its gaze wasn't locked on her in a hunter's focus. It was on the barn, on the shivering animals inside. Yes, but there was no coil of muscle, no predator's crouch. The Bobcat looked tired, defeated. Her breath steamed around the edge of her scarf as she lowered her hand from the rifle stock. The storm howled between them, a white wall closing in, and still neither moved. A sharp whinny cut through the wind. Maggie, her chestnut mare, was dancing in her stall, ears swiveling and eyes wide. The other horses shifted in restless waves. Bug slammed a hoof against his partition. The geldings tossed their heads. The rescues crowded to the far side of the enclosure. Panic could spread through them like a lit fuse if she didn't act now. "All right, easy," she murmured, forcing her voice low and steady. She stepped into the barn, the heavy door thudding shut behind her, shutting out the worst of the storm. The dim light from a single hanging bulb swayed overhead, casting the rafters in uneasy shadow. The horses turned toward her, their warm breath puffing in the cold air. She moved down the aisle, one hand trailing along Maggie's neck, the other holding the flashlight low so its beam wouldn't glare in their eyes. The mare's skin twitched under her touch, but the contact seemed to settle her. "Good girl," Sarah murmured. She kept her pace deliberate, letting the calm roll down the row. The geldings stopped pawing. Bug snorted once and stood still. Even the skittish rescues began to ease. Still, the air in the barn felt stretched thin, taut with a tension she could almost pluck like a wire. She glanced toward the break in the roof where the snow sifted in. Through the drifting flakes, she could still make out those golden eyes, unblinking, watching her. She turned her shoulder to the Bobcat, not as a show of trust, but to keep from spooking it with direct confrontation. Horses weren't the only creatures that read body language. Every movement she made was slow, measured, deliberate. She filled the water tubs again, broke the thin skin of ice with the heel of her glove, and slid more hay into the mangers. All the while she kept the wildcat in her peripheral vision. It shifted once, a ripple of fur along its back, but didn't move toward her. The injured leg stayed tucked awkwardly under its body. Snow continued to settle on its ears and shoulders, unmoving, as though it didn't care, or couldn't. Minutes stretched. The storm clawed at the siding, rattled the metal panels above, but inside the barn, a fragile equilibrium settled. The horses, though restless, were no longer frantic. The Bobcat hadn't advanced. Sarah leaned against the stall gate and let her mind weigh the facts. A healthy Bobcat wouldn't sit exposed on a roof in the middle of a blizzard, staring down a human and a herd of prey animals it had no hope of taking. This one's breathing was shallow, its fur patchy in places where the ice clung hardest. That leg wasn't going to carry it far. If it had wanted to strike, it already would have. Her jaw clenched. That didn't mean it wasn't dangerous. An injured predator could be unpredictable. She wouldn't take her eyes off it. A sudden gust forced snow through the broken section of the roof in a spray of powder that dusted her coat and stung her cheeks. She caught a flash of movement, only the Bobcat turning its head away from the blast, squinting against the wind. When it looked back, their eyes met through the swirling white. For a heartbeat, Sarah felt the storm fall away. Just her, the horses, and the battered animal clinging to the edge of the roof. She could read the stubbornness in its gaze, the same stubbornness that kept her out here 30 miles from anywhere, fixing a barn roof in a storm, refusing to bend. Another crash of wind rattled the beams, breaking the moment. She pushed away from the stall, checked every latch twice, and walked to the barn door. She cracked it open to the roar of the storm, the snow instantly needling her skin. Before stepping out, she looked back at the roofline one last time. The Bobcat had lowered its head onto its good foreleg, eyes half shut, but still facing the barn. Watching. Waiting. Sarah pulled the door closed behind her, the latch clicking into place. As she trudged toward the house for more supplies, her mind kept circling back to those golden eyes, wary, battered, but still burning in the snow. She didn't know yet whether she'd made the right choice not to scare it off. But something told her she hadn't seen the last of that wildcat. The wind had been punching the siding all night, but this sound was different. It tore through the dark with a violence that made Sarah's eyes snap open before her mind even caught up. A sharp, splintering crack, the kind that vibrates through bone, rolled over the howl of the blizzard. She was on her feet in seconds, the cold biting into her bare skin as she shoved her arms into a coat. The flashlight was already in her hand when the second sound came, the panicked thud and scrape of hooves against wooden floors. That sound, wild and desperate, meant one thing: something was wrong in the barn. Sarah yanked on her boots without socks, toes screaming at the shock, and pushed through the door. The storm swallowed her instantly. Snow came sideways in burning sheets, each flake a needle against her cheeks. She ducked her head, gripping the flashlight like a weapon, and pushed toward the barn through knee-deep drifts. The beam cut through the white chaos just enough to show what she'd feared. One whole section of the barn roof sagged at an ugly angle. Timbers snapped, shingles swallowed under a load of heavy, wet snow. Inside, the horses were in chaos. Maggie reared, striking the stall front with an iron clang, eyes rolling white. Bug was trying to climb his gate like he could scramble out of the noise. The gray geldings pressed shoulder to shoulder in the far corner, their flanks slick with sweat despite the cold. Sarah slammed the flashlight between her teeth and started yanking open latches, her voice cutting through the din. "Easy, easy, you're all right. Stay with me." She kept her tone low but firm, the way you talk to a friend on the edge of panic. Her gloved hand found Maggie's halter and held it, feeling the tremor running down the mare's neck. Then, something shifted in the corner of her eye. She turned the beam toward the roofline and froze. Two glowing golden discs stared back at her from the jagged silhouette above the collapsed section. They didn't blink. They didn't move. Snow crusted the fur around them, and the body they belonged to was hunkered low against the storm. A bobcat. Its coat was matted with ice. The rosettes dulled under frost. Even from this distance, Sarah could see the wrong angle of its hind leg, a bend that nature never intended. The animal's breath came in slow, ragged puffs that misted the air before vanishing in the wind. Her instincts screamed predator. Every muscle in her wanted to grab the rifle hanging in the mudroom and end the threat before it decided the chaos below was an invitation. The horses were frantic, and a single bad move could make them injure themselves. She felt her finger twitch with the ghost of that decision, but she didn't move. The cat wasn't crouched to spring. Its shoulders were slack, ears half back not in aggression, but in sheer exhaustion. Even from here, she could read the language of an animal too close to the edge, more likely to collapse than attack. Her breath hitched in the frigid air. The barn groaned overhead, a reminder that the roof itself might not last the night. Somewhere deep in the storm, a low, rolling gust pushed snow against the remaining beams, and Sarah felt the tremor run through the walls. She took a step toward the stall doors, keeping the bobcat in her peripheral vision, her hand still firm on Maggie's halter. "Easy, girl," she murmured. The mare's ears flicked toward her voice, the whites of her eyes fading just slightly. Sarah worked her way down the line, checking each latch, speaking in the same low rhythm. The bobcat didn't move, didn't even flinch when her light crossed its face again. Then another sound ripped through the night, short, sharp, and alien, a heavy clunk above them, like ice breaking loose but hanging by a thread. Sarah's eyes darted upward. Snow was shifting where it shouldn't. The cat's gaze flicked up too, its ears pinning flat to its head. And then, with a guttural sound that cut through the storm like a blade, it growled, not at her, not at the horses, but at the darkness above them. Sarah's eyes followed the invisible line of that warning. A massive slab of snow and ice was bulging outward on the roof, the weight of it bowing the remaining timbers. One more gust, and it would come down. The cat's eyes locked on hers for one electric heartbeat, and in that instant, she understood. This wasn't about hunger. It wasn't about territory. It was about survival, and not just its own. Her pulse surged, and she spun toward the nearest stall gate, every muscle going from cold stiff to fire hot in a second. The storm roared around her, but in that frozen moment she could hear only the crunch of shifting snow overhead, the deep warning of the animal on the roof, and the pounding of her own blood. She grabbed the lead ropes, unlatched the gate, and shoved it wide. That slab was coming down. Sarah's heart hammered like a fence post driver. The warning growl from the roof was still in her ears as she moved fast to keep the horses from bolting. The air inside the barn was thick with the scent of sweat and hay, layered with that raw, electric smell that comes when prey animals know a predator is close. Maggie sidestepped, her hooves slipping on scattered straw. Bug was trembling, not from cold, but from adrenaline. Head high, eyes sharp. Sarah knew that one wrong move now could spark a chain reaction. One panicked animal, then all of them, a tangle of hooves and fear. Her hand brushed the rifle propped near the door. Habit told her to grab it. 30 miles from town, you didn't let predators linger near your livestock. A clean shot into the air would send most creatures running. But when her flashlight beam caught those golden eyes again, her grip froze. The bobcat was still crouched low on the fractured roofline, its fur caked in frost, the rosettes barely visible under the snow. Its ears twitched against the sting of the wind, but it didn't shift toward her or the horses. One hind leg stuck out at an unnatural angle, paw barely touching the wood. Each breath it took came shallow and slow, vapor curling from its mouth before being stolen by the blizzard. This wasn't a hunter poised to strike. This was something else. Her instinct warred with reason. Injured or not, it was a wild predator. But she'd spent enough time around animals to read their posture. The cat's muscles weren't coiled, its tail wasn't lashing, its focus wasn't on attack. It was on the unstable roof, its gaze flicking to the spot where snow bulged ominously. Still, she couldn't turn her back. "Easy," she murmured to the horses, her voice low and steady. She moved down the aisle, touching each one in turn, letting them feel the calm she didn't entirely feel herself. Maggie's ears swiveled forward, then back, then forward again, as if unsure which danger to watch. Bug blew a hot snort into the cold air but stopped pawing. The gray geldings stood flank to flank, wide-eyed but holding still. The wind pressed hard against the barn, making the wooden beams groan. Snow sifted in through the torn section of roof, drifting onto the stall floor in a slow, steady fall. Sarah felt it melt against her cheeks and gloves as she tightened the latches on each stall. Her eyes kept sliding back to the roofline. The cat's head tracked her movements, but it made no move to close the distance. Its ears were angled more toward the sound of creaking wood than toward the rustle of hooves below. That, more than anything, gave her pause. Maybe it had been drawn here not by the scent of prey, but by the same instinct that drove all creatures toward shelter in a storm. Maybe it had climbed up there looking for a place to rest, only for the snow load to betray them both. Sarah crouched near Maggie's stall and brushed snow off the lead rope hanging from a hook. Her flashlight beam swept across the aisle, catching glimpses of the cat through the broken rafters. Every time their eyes met, she felt a jolt. Not of fear, exactly, but of recognition. The cat's breathing was shallow, labored. That injured leg wasn't going to carry it far in this weather. If it stayed, it was too weak to cause trouble for the horses. For now. But a hungry animal could make desperate choices, and she wasn't about to gamble with her herd's safety. A sharp pop from overhead snapped her attention back to the roof. Somewhere above the Bobcat, wood fibers strained under the weight of snow. She could almost feel the tension building, the shift of balance in the load. The Bobcat heard it too, its ears pinned flat again, not toward her, but toward the danger above. Its gaze flicked to the swollen mound of snow and ice pressing down on the warped beams. Then it looked back at her, eyes holding for a long beat before it settled low again, as if bracing for the inevitable. Sarah's breath fogged the air in front of her as she stood. The horses had quieted, but their ears and eyes still tracked the roof. She knew they trusted her to decide what came next. The wind drove another blast of snow through the gap, dusting the floor. She pulled her scarf tighter, checked each latch one last time, and backed toward the barn door. Her flashlight beam lingered on the Bobcat's face. It didn't flinch. Stepping outside, the storm swallowed her instantly, the sound of the wind louder now that the barn door wasn't muting it. She trudged toward the house, her mind turning over the choice she'd just made. Not to scare it off, not to reach for the rifle. Maybe it was foolish. Maybe it would come back to bite her. But something about those golden eyes told her the story between them wasn't over. The wind's voice shifted in the early hours. No longer the random howl of a passing squall, but a constant grinding roar that pressed on the barn like the ocean pressing on a ship's hull. Sarah felt it in her teeth as she stepped inside. A vibration carried through the beams and floorboards. She'd decided the horses couldn't stay here much longer. The partial roof collapse had left the west stalls too exposed, and the weight of snow overhead was building in all the wrong places. The feed shed was smaller, sturdier, and, most importantly, away from the sagging rafters. She moved with purpose down the aisle, sliding halters onto trembling heads, clipping lead ropes to rings. Maggie went first, ears twitching but obedient. Bug was less cooperative, jerking his head once before giving in, his breath hot against her wrist. The gray geldings came together, stepping almost in sync as they always did. The rescues balked at the open aisle, skittering sideways, but her voice, steady, low, guided them forward. Snow hissed in through the gap in the roof, melting into the damp earth floor, leaving dark patches where her boots sank. The air inside was cold enough to sting her lungs, but sweat shone along the horse's flanks from the earlier panic. She was halfway to the barn doors when she heard it. A sound that cut through the storm, guttural and raw, a growl from above, deep enough to vibrate through her chest. Her head snapped up. On the fractured roofline, the Bobcat was no longer crouched in defeat. Its body was taut now, ears pinned flat against its skull, golden eyes locked not on her, not on the horses, but on something above her head. Her instincts shouted predator, but something in the precision of that stare froze her. It wasn't looking at prey. It was looking at danger. She followed its gaze, flashlight beams slicing upward through the drifting snow. Above the central aisle, a massive slab of snow and ice bulged against the weakened rafters. She could see the way the wood bowed inward, nails straining in their holes, frost creeping in jagged lines across the load. Time stuttered. She'd patched roofs before, reinforced beams, braced walls, but nothing she'd done tonight was going to hold against that weight. The growl deepened. The Bobcat's body shifted forward on its good legs, like it could will her to move. And then the sound came, a sharp, tearing crack from the ridge, followed by the slow grind of snow breaking loose. Her muscles acted before her mind did. She lunged forward, yanking the lead ropes, her voice cutting through the roar. "Go! Go! Move!" The horses surged toward the open barn doors, hooves striking sparks on the frozen threshold. Maggie bolted first, the others following in a tide of muscle and fear. Sarah stumbled in their wake, the rope burning her palm, her shoulder wrenched as Bug tried to overtake her. Behind them, the groan became a roar. She risked a glance over her shoulder, just enough to see the moment the load gave way. The slab of snow and ice sheared from the rafters, dragging splintered wood with it, exploding onto the spot where they'd stood seconds before. A white and brown wave surged outward, slamming against the stalls and choking the aisle in powder. The air filled with the sound of it, deafening, smothering, and for a heartbeat, she couldn't tell if the roof was still coming down. Her lungs screamed for air, but her legs kept moving, driving the horses into the night. The wind swallowed them immediately. Snow stung her cheeks and eyes as she pulled the panicked animals toward the feed shed. Her boots slipped on hidden ice, each step a battle. The rope thrummed in her hands with the force of the horses pulling, but they stayed with her, trusting her lead even in the chaos. She wrenched the shed door open and drove them inside, the warmth of their bodies filling the smaller space almost instantly. Their sides heaved, breath rising in white clouds. She shut the door hard against the storm, pressing her back to it for a moment, letting her own breath slow. Only then did her mind replay what had just happened. The bulge in the roof, the crack, the wildcat's fixed stare. The growl hadn't been a threat. It had been a warning. Sarah pressed her palms to her thighs, steadying herself. The horses were safe, the shed secure. But the barn was wounded, and she still had no idea what to make of the animal on the roof. She had one undeniable fact, though. If she'd hesitated, even for a few seconds, the roof would have buried her and half the herd. The image of those golden eyes burned against the dark in her mind, steady and sure even through the blinding snow. Sarah didn't remember making the decision to run. It had happened in the space between the bobcat's growl and the sound of the roof tearing itself apart. 1 second she was in the aisle. The next she was shoving through the barn doors, yanking ropes like her life depended on it. Snow whipped sideways, erasing the world beyond the beam of her flashlight. The lead ropes burned across her palms as the horses surged, their bodies pressing in around her. She shouted to keep them moving, voice raw in her throat, every syllable snatched by the wind. Behind her came the sound, no, the impact, that would haunt her long after this night. A deep, concussive whump shook the ground, followed by the high crackle of splintering timber. Snow and debris exploded outward from the barn door in a white-brown cloud that swallowed everything in its path. Even out here it stung her cheeks and eyes, tiny shards of ice rattling against her coat. Maggie squealed, jerking her head so hard the rope almost slipped from Sarah's hand. Bug leapt sideways, nearly plowing into one of the gray geldings. The rescues scattered for half a second, then pressed close again, instinct drawing them to the herd's center. "Keep going! Move!" she barked, her voice barely audible over the storm. She dug her heels into the snow, half dragged, half leading the herd toward the darker outline ahead, the feed shed blessedly still standing against the wind. Another gust shoved them sideways. Her boot caught on something buried, and she went down to one knee, her shoulder wrenching as Bug lunged forward. Pain flared bright in the joint, but she didn't let go. She couldn't let go. The feed shed loomed closer, a squat shadow with its door banging faintly against the frame. She slammed her shoulder into it, forcing it wide enough to push the first horse through. Maggie stumbled in, nostrils flaring, eyes still white-rimmed. Bug followed, then the others in a crush of hooves and heat. The sudden stillness inside felt like a different world. The storm was reduced to a muffled roar. The wind's scream dulled by thick walls. The horses milled in the narrow space, their breath rising in quick bursts, sweat steaming off their backs. Sarah slammed the door shut and leaned against it, chest heaving, every muscle trembling. Her ears still rang from the crash, and her mind kept replaying the image. The slab of snow giving way, the timbers snapping, the space she'd stood in seconds before disappearing under an avalanche of white and wood. She should have been buried. So should half the herd. And if not for the bobcat. The thought froze her mid-breath. That wild, battered creature on the roof. It had seen it before she had. It had warned her. She'd felt it in the growl, the way its eyes had locked on the danger. Not on her. She pushed away from the door and moved through the shed, running a hand along each flank, feeling the tremors still running through them. Maggie lowered her head when Sarah reached her, pressing her forehead into Sarah's chest for a moment before shifting back to make room. "Good girl," Sarah murmured, though her own voice shook. She checked for cuts, for swelling, for any sign that the panicked sprint had done damage. Nothing serious, just adrenaline and fear, the kind that would take hours to bleed away. A new sound reached her through the shed wall, a faint, rhythmic thump. Not the wind, not snow. She crossed to the small side window and scraped the frost away with her glove. Through the swirling snow outside, she could just make out the shape of the barn, its west side sagging like a broken rib. The collapsed section was buried under a mound of drift, timbers jutting out at odd angles. And there, on the far edge of the roof, still clinging to its perch despite the destruction, was the bobcat. It was lying flat now, chest heaving, sides rising and falling in short, shallow bursts. Snow clung to its whiskers and ears. That injured hind leg was stretched awkwardly behind it, useless. Sarah's throat tightened. She didn't know how it had stayed up there through the collapse. She didn't know why it hadn't fled the noise, the chaos, the herd of prey animals exploding from the barn. But she knew this much. If it hadn't been there, she and the horses might be under that snow right now. For a long moment, she just stood there, one hand braced on the cold window frame, watching the animal through the blur of snow. Then she turned back to the herd. There was work to do, water to break, hay to spread, ropes to coil. The storm was still howling, and they'd be here for hours, maybe days. But in the back of her mind, the image of those golden eyes, bright against the white, burned like a brand. She wasn't done with that bobcat, and she had a feeling it wasn't done with her either. By the time the worst of the wind had passed, the shed felt almost too quiet. The horses stood close together, their breathing finally settling into slow, even draws. Maggie had found a corner she liked and planted herself there, one hip cocked in the relaxed stance of an animal who knows the danger has passed, for now. The others mirrored her calm, heads lowering to the hay Sarah had spread over the floor. Sarah sat on an overturned feed bucket, rolling her aching shoulder. The joint throbbed from where Bug's sudden lunge had wrenched it, but she counted herself lucky. No real injuries, no broken bones, and all 7 horses alive. That was more than she dared hope for an hour ago. Still, her mind wouldn't let go of the image of the barn. Even through the shed wall, she could hear the occasional creak of wood shifting under the weight of snow, the ghost of the collapse replaying itself in her head. And then, there was the bobcat. She hadn't gone back for it during the storm. It was too dangerous, and she'd had her hands full keeping the herd safe. But she couldn't shake the memory of its eyes locking on hers right before the roof gave way, that low growl vibrating in her bones. When the snow eased enough for her to step outside, she pulled her coat tight and trudged toward the barn. The yard was unrecognizable, drifts sculpted into strange shapes by the wind, her earlier tracks nearly erased. The barn's west side sagged like an old man's back, the roofline broken and uneven. She scanned the roofline first. No sign of movement, no golden eyes. The place where the bobcat had crouched was now just a jagged edge of snow and shattered shingles. A fresh gust rattled the loose boards, sending a puff of powder into the air. Sarah ducked inside, boots crunching over frozen debris. The cold hit her first, sharper in here than in the shed, the wind sliding through the new gaps. The collapsed section was a mess of timbers and ice, the aisle half blocked. She picked her way through the wreckage, careful not to dislodge anything that might bring more down. Her flashlight beam swept across the far stalls, over the broken boards and scattered hay. That's when she saw it. In the darkest corner of the damaged stall, curled into a tight, miserable knot, was the bobcat. Its fur was matted with ice and mud, and its injured hind leg was tucked awkwardly against its belly. One ear twitched at the sound of her boots in the straw, but it didn't lift its head. Only its eyes moved, following her with a steady, unblinking stare. Sarah stopped just inside the stall doorway. Her pulse quickened, but not from fear. It was clear now the animal hadn't gone far because it couldn't. "You stayed," she murmured, the sound almost lost in the cavernous cold. She didn't step closer. Wild animals, especially injured ones, could lash out without warning. But she also didn't turn away. Instead, she shrugged off one of the old horse blankets she'd carried in from the shed earlier. It was frayed and smelled faintly of dust, but it was thick and dry. She laid it down on the straw a few feet from the bobcat, the sound of the fabric soft against the frozen floor. The cat's ears twitched again, but it didn't move. From her coat pocket, she pulled a shallow feed pan and set it on the blanket. She filled it halfway from her thermos of water, the liquid steaming faintly in the frigid air. It wasn't an offering in the human sense, and she wasn't fool enough to think this was the start of some domestication story. It was simply a choice. If the cat was going to die here, it wouldn't be from thirst, and it wouldn't be lying on frozen ground. She stepped back to the doorway and waited. At first, nothing happened. The cat kept its head low, eyes half-lidded. Then, with visible effort, it shifted forward, dragging its bad leg behind it. The movement was slow, deliberate. It stopped on the edge of the blanket, sniffed the pan, and lapped once. Then again. Sarah exhaled slowly, realizing she'd been holding her breath. When it finished, the bobcat curled back into itself, still facing her, as if making it clear that trust was not part of the bargain. "Fair enough," she said under her breath. She left the stall the way she'd entered, slow, careful, making sure nothing in her movement felt like a challenge. Outside, the wind had picked up again, but it no longer carried the frantic edge it had before. She crossed back to the shed, knowing she'd check on the animal again come morning. That night, as she lay on the thin cot in the feed shed, the sound of the horses breathing around her, she couldn't stop picturing the bobcat's eyes in the lamplight. Tired, watchful, but still burning. They'd both survived the night. And though neither had spoken the words, an agreement had been struck. The storm broke overnight. leaving a brittle, aching silence in its wake. By morning, the Wyoming plains lay smothered under a deep white blanket, the horizon a clean, unbroken line. Sunlight bounced hard off the snow, almost blinding, and the air was so cold it felt like it would crack if she spoke too loudly. Sarah pushed open the feed shed door, the hinges groaning in protest. The horses blinked against the sudden brightness, but didn't stir from their hay. They had settled into this space now, the chaos of the night before fading into the quiet routines of survival. The barn was another matter. From the outside, it looked like a wounded animal. One side slumped, the roof jagged where the collapse had ripped through. She stepped carefully through the frozen debris, her boots crunching on shards of ice and splintered wood. The Bobcat was still there. It hadn't moved far from where she'd left it, still curled in that corner, injured leg tucked in tight. The old horse blanket lay rumpled beneath it, the feed pan pushed aside. When her boots crunched over the threshold, its head came up, eyes tracking her every step. No growl, no hiss, just that watchfulness. "Morning," she said softly, setting another shallow pan of water on the edge of the blanket. This time she didn't linger. She'd learned the night before that the cat preferred her at a distance, and she respected that. The days began to fall into a rhythm. In the mornings, she'd tend to the horses in the shed, breaking the ice in their water buckets, tossing flakes of hay into the corners so no one had to fight for a spot. Then she'd cross to the barn, her breath pluming in the bitter cold, to check on the Bobcat. It never approached her, but it didn't leave either. Sometimes it drank the water she left. Sometimes it didn't. Once, she caught it grooming the fur around its bad leg, the motion slow and stiff. Another time, she noticed faint, uneven tracks in the snow just outside the broken stall wall, as if it had stepped out briefly, then turned back. She worked on the barn between snow squalls, repairing what she could without making the structure unstable. The damaged section was beyond a quick fix. She'd need fresh beams, shingles, and more hands than just hers to make it right. But she could brace the east wall, replace a few cracked boards, and shore up the stalls that hadn't been damaged. The Bobcat watched her the whole time. Sometimes she'd glance up from her work to find its eyes on her through the half-light of the stall. Other times, she'd catch only the flick of an ear in her direction, the faintest acknowledgement of her presence. By the third day, she realized the horses had stopped reacting to the cat at all. On the first morning after the storm, they'd still pricked their ears and snorted when she left for the barn, uneasy about the predator's scent. Now they barely looked up. Maybe they'd decided, like she had, that the animal was no threat. Not in this state, and not here. The quiet between them began to feel familiar. At night, in the feed shed, Sarah would sometimes lie awake listening to the wind rattle loose boards on the barn. She'd picture the Bobcat curled on the blanket, breathing slow, conserving its strength. It was a strange sort of comfort, knowing something else was out there enduring the same cold. One afternoon, she lingered a little longer in the stall after setting down fresh water. The light was thin, slanting through the broken roof in pale gold stripes. The Bobcat shifted, its body rolling slightly to one side so the good leg stretched out. She noticed then that its breathing sounded stronger, not the labored, shallow pulls from before. "Getting better," she murmured. The ears twitched, but the eyes stayed on her. She left before the moment could turn into anything more. By the end of the week, she'd made enough progress on the barn to move the horses back into the undamaged stalls. It felt strange at first, hearing the familiar shuffle and snort of them in their old spaces, the rhythmic chew of hay against the winter quiet. The bobcat didn't move from its corner, though its head would turn when the sound of hooves echoed through the aisle. The truce between them had become something steadier. She didn't try to close the distance, and it didn't try to leave. Two creatures, each keeping to their own side of the line, bound by a shared understanding. Survival first. The wind picked up again one night, rattling the loose panels on the roof. She lay awake in her small bedroom above the tack room, staring at the ceiling. Somewhere below her, in the shadowed corner of the barn, the bobcat would be doing the same. Listening, waiting, conserving energy for whatever came next. Neither of them knew how long this arrangement would last. But for now it worked. For now, in the deep, unforgiving winter, they were neighbors. The cold had a way of settling into the bones at night, even when the wind had died. Sarah sat at her workbench in the tack room, the single kerosene lamp hissing softly beside her. The glass chimney glowed a warm amber, throwing long shadows across the walls lined with bridles, worn leather, and tools. Outside, the temperature had dropped so sharply that every sound seemed sharper. Boots on the floor, the faint creak of a beam, the pop of the cooling stove in the corner. She was mending a strap from Maggie's halter, the needle moving through the leather with slow, deliberate pulls. Her hands knew the work by muscle memory, but her mind kept drifting. The barn was quiet except for the soft rustle of horses shifting in their stalls, and somewhere beyond them, in that dim corner under the patched roof, the bobcat would be curled on its blanket, eyes half shut, but ears tuned to every sound. The lamp's light flickered, catching on the photo tacked to the wall just above her bench. It was an old one. Her and Jack at the county fair, sunburned and grinning, standing with the roan gelding they'd broken together that summer. She hadn't looked closely at it in months. Now the smile on her younger self felt like something she'd borrowed and never returned. She set the halter down, her fingers tracing the edge of the photo without touching it. Jack had been gone 5 winters now. The accident had been fast and senseless. A slip on the ice, a bad fall, and suddenly she was alone in this place they'd built together. The first winter after, she'd moved through the days like someone carrying a weight too heavy to set down. The chores got done, the animals were fed, but there was no voice answering hers in the barn, no second set of footsteps in the snow. She remembered that feeling, waking up every morning to the same cold, inside and out. Her gaze drifted to the stall where the bobcat lay hidden in shadow. She could picture its eyes even now, the way they held that same hollow look she used to see in the mirror. Not fear exactly, not even pain, just the raw absence of anything to hold on to. Maybe that's why she hadn't driven it off. The thought settled in quietly, the way snow settles on fence posts. She'd told herself it was because the animal was injured, too weak to be a threat. But that wasn't the whole truth. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she recognized the look of something just trying to outlast the storm. She stood, pulling her coat tighter around her, and stepped into the aisle. The lamplight followed her in a wavering halo as she crossed the barn. The horses shifted, but didn't call out. This was a routine they knew by now. At the far end, she stopped just short of the bobcat's stall. It lifted its head as if it had been expecting her. The light caught in its eyes, turning them molten gold for a moment, before the shadow took them back. "You're still here," she said softly. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it filled the quiet. The cat didn't move, didn't tense. It simply watched her. For a moment she imagined saying the rest out loud. The part she'd never said to anyone in town, not even the friends who'd tried to coax her into selling this place after Jack died. That some winters aren't about living well or strong, but about just holding on long enough to see spring. That sometimes survival isn't about the body at all. It's about making sure the darkness doesn't convince you you're alone in it. But she didn't say it. Instead, she set the small enamel dish of water down where she always did, nudging it gently with the toe of her boot so it rested in the same place each time. She pulled her coat tighter and stepped back, letting the animal decide when or if it would drink. Back in the tack room, she poured herself a mug of coffee from the thermos, the bitter smell grounding her. She leaned back in the old chair, listening to the layered sounds of the barn, the horses breathing, the stove ticking, and somewhere in the far stall, the faint scrape of claws on wood as the bobcat shifted position. She thought about that first winter without Jack, about how she'd survived it by counting small victories, patching a roof leak alone, getting the tractor started in sub-zero cold, making it through to March without losing an animal. And she realized now that she hadn't truly been alone then either. She'd had the horses, the work, the rhythm of chores that kept her moving when she wanted to stop. The bobcat, she suspected, understood that same rhythm. Eat when you can. Rest when you can. Keep your head up just enough to watch the weather change. The lamp sputtered once, then steadied. She smiled faintly, though there was no one to see it. They were both just trying to find shelter from the cold, and from the storms that didn't show on the weather map. By late February, the snow began to change. It no longer fell in endless walls that erased the horizon. Instead, it came in fits, short bursts that dusted the ground before giving way to sunlight. During the day, water trickled down from the eaves, catching in the deep ruts Sarah's boots had carved over the past weeks. The air still carried winter's bite, but now it also smelled faintly of thawing earth. The barn repairs were slow, but the structure was holding. She'd moved the horses back into their stalls, and the rhythm of feeding, watering, and mucking felt steady again. The bobcat remained in its corner, but it was no longer the limp, silent bundle she'd first found after the storm. Its eyes were brighter now. Its breathing was stronger. And every so often, she'd see it standing in the stall's shadow, testing its bad leg with a careful step. Then one morning, fresh tracks appeared in the snow outside the barn. Sarah found them when she stepped out to haul a bale from the feed shed. They were light but distinct, weaving toward the tree line and back again, a pattern that told her the bobcat had started venturing farther than the barn doorway. She crouched to study them, noting the uneven gait. That leg wasn't healed, but it was healing. When she checked the stall later, the blanket was rumpled, the water pan empty. The cat was curled up as usual, but its ears flicked in her direction with a kind of restless energy she hadn't seen before. "Thinking about moving on, aren't you?" she murmured. The days passed, and the tracks multiplied. Some mornings they led toward the creek, other times toward the low ridge to the west. Once, she saw them circling the hay bales stacked under the tarp, as if the animal had paused there to scent the air. She didn't follow them. It wasn't her place to. By early March, the nights were still bitter, but the sun lingered longer each evening. The horses spent more time outside, their coats catching the light as they nosed through the patches of exposed grass. Sarah caught herself glancing toward the barn less often, no longer listening for every small sound from the bobcat's stall. And then, one morning, it was gone. The blanket lay empty, a few stray hairs clinging to the worn fibers. The water pan was untouched. The air in the stall felt hollow in a way it hadn't for weeks. She stood there for a long time, one hand resting on the doorframe. She'd known this was coming, but the stillness it left behind was sharper than she'd expected. "Well," she said quietly, "safe travels." She didn't see the Bobcat again for weeks. The tracks appeared off and on near the creek, lighter now, more balanced. She told herself they might belong to another cat entirely. It was easier than wondering. Life pulled her forward. Repairs to finish, fence lines to check, seed orders to place before the ground fully thawed. Then came the morning on the ridge. It was a clear day, the kind that made the sky look impossibly wide. She'd been riding the far pasture fence on Maggie, checking for winter damage. As they crested a low rise, movement on the ridge beyond caught her eye. A bobcat stood there, silhouetted against the pale blue. Its fur looked fuller now, the rosettes sharp against the tawny coat. It stood square on all four legs. Beside it, smaller and slighter, was another cat. Her breath caught. The younger one shifted, brushing against the larger's shoulder, then sat back on its haunches. The adult turned its head toward her. Even at this distance, she felt the weight of that gaze. For a moment, they simply regarded each other across the stretch of snow and grass. It wasn't the same hollow look she'd seen in the stall weeks ago. There was strength there now, and something else, a quiet acknowledgement. Then, without haste, the bobcat turned and padded into the pines, the smaller one following close. Their tracks melted into shadow. Sarah sat there for a while, Maggie shifting beneath her, ears twitching at the breeze. She thought about how easy it would have been to drive that animal off the night of the storm, to treat it as nothing but a threat, and how, if she had, neither of them would have made it to this moment. Some bonds, she realized, don't depend on proximity. Some are strongest when you let them go. She turned Maggie toward home, the ridge fading behind them. The wind carried the faintest smell of pine and melting snow, and she found herself smiling. Not because the bobcat was gone, but because it had returned on its own terms and left the same way. It had survived. And so had she. The first true thaw came with a sound, a steady dripping from the eaves, punctuated by the occasional hollow whump of snow sliding from the barn roof. Sarah stood on the porch steps with a mug of coffee, watching the yard slowly reappear from under its white shroud. Patches of brown grass showed through in uneven shapes, the first stubborn shoots of green pushing through near the fence line. The horses moved lazily in the paddock, coats shaggy with the last of their winter fur. Maggie stood nearest the gate, her ears relaxed, tail swishing idly. Bug dozed in the sun. Even the skittish rescues seemed content to nose through the patchy snow for something edible. Sarah's eyes drifted to the ridge in the distance. The same ridge where, not long ago, she'd seen the bobcat standing with the smaller one at its side. She hadn't spotted them again, but she still found their tracks now and then near the creek, or along the tree line after a light snow. They were faint, never close to the barn, as if some unspoken boundary remained in place. She wrapped her hands around the mug, letting the heat sink into her fingers. This winter had been a hard one, even by Wyoming standards. The storm had been the kind people talked about for years, how the wind had erased whole roads, how roofs had caved in across the county, how livestock had been lost. And yet here she stood, every one of her horses accounted for, the barn still standing, wounded, but standing. And maybe, she thought, that survival had depended on more than just her own hands. She thought about that night in the barn, the growl that had pulled her gaze upward just in time, the slab of snow breaking free, the chaos that followed. If the bobcat hadn't been there, hadn't reacted when it did, well, she knew the ending would have been different. The memory brought a strange warmth with it. Not gratitude in the human sense. They were different creatures, with different lives, but recognition. They had both listened to each other that night, in their own way, and it had saved them. She took a slow sip of coffee and let her mind wander back through the weeks since. The quiet coexistence, the way the cat's eyes had slowly shifted from hollow to alert, the moment on the ridge with the smaller one at its side. Jack used to say the land taught you lessons, if you were willing to pay attention. She figured that winter had proved him right. The storm had taught her how to listen, not just to the obvious signs, like the snap of wood or the whistle of wind, but to the subtler warnings, a shift in posture, a pause in the air, a sound that didn't fit. It had also reminded her that help sometimes comes from where you least expect it. She'd spent years thinking survival was just a matter of grit and preparation, keeping the fences mended, the hay dry, the water thawed, and it was, mostly. But that winter had shown her something else. Sometimes survival means recognizing an ally even when it comes with claws. Her gaze drifted to the tree line again. The pines swayed gently in the warming breeze, their shadows long on the snow. A flicker of movement caught her eye, but it could have been anything. A magpie, a gust shaking loose a clump of ice, or maybe not. She smiled faintly. That was the thing about some connections. You didn't always need to see them to know they were still there. She turned back toward the barn. The repairs weren't done, and spring work would come fast. Fences to mend, fields to prep, foals to watch for in the neighboring pastures. Life would move forward, as it always did after winter, whether she was ready or not. But as she set her empty mug on the porch rail, she let herself linger on one last thought. They'd survived that winter. She and the horses, and somewhere out there, the bobcat and its smaller companion, because they'd listened to the storm, to the silence, and just for a moment, to each other. She wondered, not for the first time, how many other warnings she'd missed in her life because she hadn't been paying attention. How many times help had been closer than she thought, wearing a shape she didn't expect. Her boots crunched on the thawing path as she headed for the paddock. The sun was warm on her back, but the wind still carried a bite. She paused at the gate, looking out over the pasture and then back toward the ridge. "Who's been your unexpected warning call?" she murmured, almost to herself. It wasn't really a question for her. It was for anyone who'd ever stood alone in their own kind of winter, wondering how they'd make it through. Because sometimes, the thing that saves you isn't the thing you thought you needed, and you don't know it until it's gone, or until it comes back when you least expect it. The breeze shifted, carrying the faint smell of pine from the ridge. For a heartbeat, she thought she saw a shadow move between the trees. Maybe it was the wind, or maybe, just maybe, it was still watching.